Hi everyone, this is your host Prasha and welcome to our STEM Stories, episode number 83. If you live in the US and celebrate the holiday of Thanksgiving, I want to wish you and your family a very happy Thanksgiving. This week also marks our second birthday, and so it's really special for me and everyone who is associated with the show. So thank you so much for 2 wonderful years. If you're just joining us on this journey, make sure you go back and listen to 80 plus incredible stories in STEM professions from around the world. And today's episode is just exactly that, super inspiring. The story of Tina, of how she went from becoming a computer science engineer, studying at MIT, to starting her own company and bringing inclusivity and diversity to technology. So let's get started.
Welcome to Her STEM Story, a podcast about real women with extraordinary science, technology, engineering, and mathematics stories. In this show, we'll talk to some absolutely inspiring women and highlight some women-led organizations in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We'll learn more about their work, their struggles, and how they think we can close the gender gap in STEM professions. Keep listening to get inspired.
Our guest today is Tina Huang, the CTO and founder of Transposit, a Silicon Valley startup that is changing how APIs are written. And she has a degree in computer engineering from MIT, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Tina's story is filled with pivots and with interesting turns that she's taken in her Silicon Valley career. So let's talk to Tina to learn more about her amazing STEM story. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I was reading your whole life story, and trust me, I have never seen all the names of all the big companies in one form. So you have worked for everyone.
It's funny because I've recently started reading that book, Radical Candor, and Kim Scott, who's the author of that book, actually, her experiences and what she writes about are almost exactly the same company profile. She was at Google first, and then she moved to Apple, and then she proceeds to do some consulting for Twitter.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. That's kind of like the big tech three, if you will. So tell us a little bit more about how you got started on this path. So just tell us a little bit about your background and what do you do for a living today?
Right. So my background is in computer science. I have always wanted to be a computer science person since I think I was in high school playing with just coding on HTML sites, taking my first ever, I think it was a Pascal class. So I've always really liked computer science, but I've also had this other interest. I had a brief stint when I was at MIT where I thought I might be a management major. So I've always had this curiosity about business management as well, which luckily that's eventually drawn me to entrepreneurship. I've always been curious about having startups because I wanted to be able to exercise both the technical side and the business side and the human side of building technology. And I get that now. I'm a co-founder and CTO of Transposit, which is a company that we're building in what we call an API composition platform targeted towards developers to make it easier for them to build applications.
Awesome. So, of course, you must have a lot of classmates at MIT who had their own startups, right?
It's interesting. I think part of it is the result of when I graduated. I graduated in 2001, which those of you who can remember was the collapse of the tech bubble.
Yeah.
And so surprisingly, I think that led to a lot of pullback. So I was fortunate that my sister actually, she graduated in the height of the tech bubble in 2000, but she had the skepticism around the startup bubble back then. And even though my mom kept asking her, why don't you join one of these fancy tech startups? She chose to go to Apple Computer instead. because she thought that it was a bubble. She wanted somewhere that was stable, who was building real product and real technology. And so when the bubble collapsed and I graduated somewhat unexpectedly, I graduated after only 3 years and I wasn't sure if I would graduate. So I was looking for jobs in the spring of 2001 after the bubble had burst and no one was hiring. So it was just a bit of luck that I ended up luckily getting a job at Apple. And it turned out to be the exact job I wanted and my dream job, which is to work on an application framework where there's only maybe a few of at the time it was basically either Apple, working at Sun, or, one of the other Linux frameworks.
Mm-hmm. That's incredible. So Apple has come a long way, tech has come a long way, and you've come a long way since 2001, right? So that's pretty interesting for sure. And tech always, gets me all curious because I personally cannot code for the life of me. Like if I had to save my life, I couldn't code. And, my brain's not structured like that. But I never understand these big platforms and how this all works. And so if you had to explain what you do to a 5-year-old or me who has no clue how the whole tech world works, can you explain that?
How the whole tech world works?
Or your company. I mean your company. I was asking a big question, but I meant how does your company work, and how does this API thing kind of functions?
Yeah, so most of the applications you use, whether it's Google Calendar, Google Mail, Twitter, Facebook, they all have what's called an application programming interface. And that's a way that you can, as a computer, tell the application to do something. So rather than you having to point and click to schedule an event or send a message, you can have a computer algorithmically or automatically do that for you. And so you talk to these different applications through what's called an API. And even though that sounds really, really easy, in practice as a developer, there's just a lot of mess you have to go through. So what we do is we just make that easier to do. We make it easy for people to build applications that need to connect to all of the different places that you interact with day in and day out. Yeah. So one of the ways I like to, or one of the examples I like to put out there is one of the inspirations for building Transposit, and this came maybe 3 or 4 years before I started the company. I was really good friends with my dog walker, and at some point she was temporarily living on my couch, and I would watch her at the end of every month spend maybe 5 or 10 hours going through her Google Calendar and trying to invoice all of her clients. So she would go through her calendar, find my dog Rocky, figure out what days she walked him and for how long, and then hand in her notebook, fill out an invoice, then type it into an email and then send it to me. And this was very problematic for her because she would often miss dates and get underpaid. But also it was 10 hours that she wasn't being paid for and doing a job she didn't like doing. And so I saw that and said, let me build you an application to invoice your customers for you. So I built an application that talked to her Google Calendar, let her look over the dates for a particular dog, edit any discrepancies there were, and then she could just copy and paste this invoice to each of her clients. That kind of application feels, any one of them isn't necessarily that powerful or that meaningful, but it has so much power to help all of these businesses, even if it's a small business like my dog walker, that let her focus on what she really loves doing, which is being with the dogs, not emailing her clients. And so Transposit is the platform that makes it easier for me to build those solutions to make my friends, make their lives easier.
Which is so cool because right now there's an app for everything, right? And I try to, go into that sector, try to build something and, try to learn like how to do that. It's very expensive. If you wanted to get an app built, at least in today's market, it's expensive, and it's for someone like me who doesn't know, right, all the details of it. People can also take advantage of you, and it takes a long time as well. So it's not easy thing to get an app built. I mean, even though it looks easy because there's so many of them.
Absolutely. And another piece that I feel like motivated building Transposit is, I think that this is somewhat of a gendered take, but I noticed a lot of women would become intimidated by coding.
Yes.
And in a way that I think is based off of the environments, the coding environments we provide them. So if you think about your average intro to coding online tutorial or a coding class, or like a coding hackathon, they usually start with a blank slate. So bring your laptop, you have nothing set up, and you just have to figure out how to get everything to work. And the iteration cycle and the feedback can often be frustrating. And then if you don't feel like you feel comfortable, either from imposter syndrome or something else, if you don't feel comfortable then asking for help, you'll just lose that motivation to do it. At the same time, I think it's a lot easier to take an application that already exists and tweak it. And I think you can see this by the fact that a lot more women are drawn towards web design, for instance. And I think that's because there you have a full website that you can look at the HTML that's around there, and you can easily tweak it and edit it and style it, and you see that visual feedback. So we think about this a lot in the product design of Transposit. How can we make the developing experience have that quick iteration loop, that quick feedback, that delight that you get when you just get started? And it's interesting because I just interviewed a candidate yesterday that was a woman who has development experience, but she talked about one of the delightful things she saw when she played with Transposit is the way we structure into these small blocks really makes it easier for her to think about how to get started building the application she wants to build.
That makes so much sense, because that's one of the reasons I could never get into coding, is because, yeah, you're right, it's intimidating, and it's, there's just too many things that you have to do, and then the end result is not always as pretty as a website or a blog or an Instagram page, or there's a factor of that prettiness. I guess you can say that's the reward, and it's just a very, and you can tell that men have made this. You can totally tell from the aesthetics of a lot of these coding platforms that there are men behind it, because there is no pink and there's no teal. There are no colors that are aesthetically pleasing, which women have more sense of, colors and creativity. That's for sure, right?
Yes, and I like to not fully make it about whether it's visual or not, because I think that feedback can come in other forms. And so what I really like to focus on isn't just the aesthetics and the color, even though I actually spend a lot of time thinking about the Transposit colors and our branding and marketing. But when I think about feedback and what actually intimidates women from coding, I think it's just a feedback loop, and that can be text coming back on the screen. It doesn't have to be shiny, it doesn't have to be pretty, but you want to have iterative feedback so that you can know that you're doing the right thing.
Yes, definitely. I think they're both a part of it. I'm just talking from my personal experience, where I just thought that men are really making this stuff, because you can totally tell that it's not very inclusive, and it's not very thought through, which, like you mentioned, that the purpose of your business is not just to do business, but also to encourage minorities and women to come join this field, right, which is so male dominated. And there's a lot of word around the whole diversity inclusion dialogue in the tech world. So tell us a little bit about your experience with that, because you've worked with these big 3 companies, and was there any something that you absolutely loved about the diversity and inclusion programs, or was there something that you really hated?
I think the notion of diversity and inclusion programs has evolved a lot in the last 15 or 18 years that I've been in the industry. I think in the early days, other than having SWE groups, which is software, like women in engineering groups, there weren't as many women diversity initiatives in the early days. My experience has been interesting in that I've never had the very obvious, blatant, explicit discrimination, such as being sexually harassed, or even things that the obvious, being told that you don't belong messages. It actually didn't happen to me until much later in my career, hitting the glass ceiling. And so that's an area that I find I spend a lot of time thinking about, because I think that when I was younger, I had parents that were both engineers. I was always encouraged to be an engineer. And so I never felt that there was any limit. And even in my early days of my career, when I worked at Apple, for instance, I was not there were only 2 women on the team.
Wow.
But even still, I was the first person they had ever hired onto that team that was straight out of undergraduate. And this team came from Next Step. So they'd been around for, at that time, 15 or so years. And so I was never told that I wasn't good enough. After 6 months at Apple, I was promoted. And so early in my career, I definitely got all of that positive feedback that was, you can do this. You are a solid, competent engineer. And so I think it's a combination of that glass ceiling that happens when you start competing for the upper echelons of the tech field, where it becomes a lot more political, in combination with the fact that the tech industry itself changed. Because in the early days of my career, at least, I think that there was less of this bro culture and less sort of that fratty, you have to belong and you have to look and act a certain way.
Yeah.
Because it was a lot more of just sort of a nerd culture in the early days.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it's always when we get towards the, really, really high positions where there's still lesser women. So there's still lesser women up there to support other women. And that kind of keeps everyone from achieving those big goals, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how are you changing that? That now that you're in an executive level role, you're a founder, how are you changing that at Transposit and addressing that issue?
I think that there are a number of ways that we do things differently. Everything from the way we think about recruiting. So a piece of it is, even in the early days, we had recruiters source candidates because we knew that if we just tapped into our existing networks, they would be largely white and male, because that is the makeup of the companies that we worked for. And so I think even from a sourcing perspective, not hiring your buddies and the people you already know, but at least looking outside of your network is one way to sort of increase diversity. Another aspect that I've been thinking a lot about is, we talk at Transposit a lot about being a culture of pragmatism. And so for people who aren't in tech, this might seem crazy, but a lot of engineering cultures encourage and support engineers that are really just interested in playing with whatever the latest, greatest new technology is, rather than building something that your users can benefit from. So at Transposit, we explicitly try not to encourage that. We say we want people who, rather than rewriting something that is already perfectly functional and rewriting that into some new programming language or on some new framework just for fun, Instead, we want people who are more excited to build a new feature that will help our users. And what's interesting about that pragmatism, I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and I actually think even in the early phone screens, we end up sampling in a lot more women than men, so that the number of candidates that come on site ends up being a lot more balanced. And I think that's because women have this natural pragmatic nature to them, and we've also been encouraged and forced to have that, whether it's from having to run the households or having to just navigate a male-dominated world.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's so much more to the skills that we bring as women because of, as you said, as our background, and also like that, how important that is for organizations to recognize that. And of course, diversify hiring is a big thing. I always see people hiring from their same colleges, and it becomes like a big alumni group sometimes.
For sure.
Yeah, definitely. So you're also interested in how humans interact with technology and that whole cultural anthropology aspect of it, and you did some research on it at University of Chicago for about 9 months. So tell us a little bit about that period and how kind of you went from this hardcore tech world to study anthropology.
So I was at Apple for about 3 years, and at the time I wasn't disillusioned by tech the way that a lot of women might be now. I just felt unsatisfied with the day in and day out. And I think part of it is the Apple engineering environment back then is very different than the open workspace startup type environments that we see in today's tech companies. So I just felt unhappy. I had my own office. It was very dark in that office. No one to talk to. My coworkers and I did not share common interests. And so I just felt like I needed something that was a little bit more social or a different collaboration environment. And so at the time, I wasn't 100% sure that I would come back to computer science or engineering, but I just decided to go study at University of Chicago, and it was actually in the Department of the Humanities. But I ended up being really interested in blogging as a form of storytelling. And so at University of Chicago, there's a core curriculum, but then you can just take whatever classes you want and pick anything you want for your thesis. And in full disclosure, I actually didn't complete my master's there, but I at least spent the 9 months there studying different social sciences and humanities. And so what was interesting about it is I didn't even, having come from MIT, I honestly knew nothing about that cultural anthropology even existed as a field of study. And I had no idea that there were things like ethnographic methods and social, survey methodology classes like that. And so it was my first exposure to that sort of training. And so a combination of my interest in blogging and just random chance. It was a friend of mine who had a friend who worked at Google, put my resume in, but that landed me on the blogger team at Google because I had this, both the engineering background, but also this high level interest in blogging as a platform.
Oh, that's incredible. That's awesome. That seems like a dream come true. I hope someone picks up my podcast so I can work at Google.
Yeah, and I felt very fortunate because at the time, Google was very flexible with their 20% time. So Google has this policy where you can spend 20% of your time working on projects that aren't your main project. Almost everyone uses that time to work on a different software engineering project, but I did mine in user research. And so I actually got to learn from trained user researchers and do qualitative interviews and user research inside labs.
Mm-hmm.
We were looking at the mobile news client and usability studies. And so I actually was able to get some level of professional training on that side of the field.
Yeah. And that's amazing, because I feel like the more and more we get towards this new age technology with, the AI and, all kinds of devices that we have in our houses, it's very important to have people like yourselves in the background who know something about how humans interact with each other, or how, certain ethnicities or certain groups can react to something differently than others. And I'm glad that, there are studies happening for it. So you just have a perfect background. I mean, this is incredible. Because I've heard a couple of stories of people like really going from STEM to anthropology, but then they kind of go into just writing part of it, right? Just if they go to humanities, then they'll end up mostly in the writing piece. But this is a perfect story for anyone who's listening, especially if younger girls who are trying to get into STEM and are interested in the computer science piece of it. There's so many ways this can all pan out. So what would be your piece of advice to that young girl who's trying to become a computer science engineer but has unlimited potential?
I feel like as time goes on, we'll start to realize that coding and engineering is a tool. It's a form of literacy that everyone needs to have. And so I feel like the notion that you would pick even a humanities degree and not want to at least understand some aspects of how computers and technology work, I feel like you'd be very limiting in your future paths. For instance, I am working with a woman as a marketing consultant for my company, and she was a Stanford music major, and she was fortunate to be hired into Google at the time under Sheryl Sandberg, where they were looking for explicitly Ivy League trained humanities majors to teach companies how to use AdWords. They needed smart people who understood technology but had the ability to explain it and listen to their customers and hear what problems they had and incorporate that feedback back to the product. So it's that combination of skills that's necessary. However, the same person, she says, when she talks to young Stanford women now, you couldn't get that job at Google with a music degree anymore. So I think that it's worth at least having some level of tech sophistication under your belt. Another example is my sister. She was always interested in botany. And so she fought with my mom for much of her undergraduate time and was ultimately convinced to double major in plant biology and computer science. If you fast forward 10 years, she ends up getting a PhD in botany and really enjoying that science. But the landscape of what it means to be a botanist has changed as well. A lot of the pipetting, the lab work, that's either offshored or done by robots now. So much of the work that biologists do is data. And data, having, whether it's you're actually writing code, and understanding of how to think about structuring data matters. And so she does spend some of her time now trying to teach some of these fundamentals of data structures or using source control to scientists so that they can do their jobs more effectively.
Yeah, that makes total sense, because all the research that we look at is data analysis, right? So someone's doing the experiments, and then there's this whole analysis that says whether the hypothesis is true or not. And it makes total sense that as we have more ability to collect more data points, we'll have more and smarter computers to process them, right? So, I did chemical and mechanical engineering, but towards the very end of my master's, it was all about, the learning the Fourier transforms and Z transforms and all this math that actually makes the computers run. And there would come a point where the professor would say, "Oh, you can't solve it. Like the computer has to solve it. Like there's a human limitation to what you can solve and how far you can go." And computers kind of take that away and definitely get us one step closer to solving some of these grand challenges, if you will, right? So
absolutely,
we can't escape them for too long. I mean, I complain about coding, but I had to eventually learn it too for my job as a mechanical engineer. And I didn't, I wasn't very happy, but, I made it work. So it definitely makes you feel much more understanding of how all the stuff around you works so that you can use it to your best possible advantage, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So tell us, what's been your favorite resource or tool in your STEM journey, if you had to pick one or maybe two?
My favorite resource or tool. I need help defining what you mean by resource or tool.
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of, how if there's any kind of like app or if there's any kind of like resource that helped you overcome maybe imposter syndrome or to find a job, it can be of multiple things. I just asked this because, as a part of the podcast, what we're trying to do is deliver maybe a tool or resource to our audience where then they can use it in their day-to-day life. So a lot of people will say, some people would say Twitter because they think Twitter is a great way to build a community. And then some people would say, WordPress because I built my blog on it and it's free and, stuff like that. So that's just where I ask it from. But if you don't have one, that's fine too.
No, I have one, which is instant message. And that has changed technologies over time. I believe when I started my career, it was probably AOL Instant Messenger, and later became Google Hangouts. But I'm a bit of an introvert by nature, but also I, like many, had some levels of imposter syndrome when I started out.
Yeah.
And so having access to individuals that I trusted and was able to ask in a private conversation, how should I do this thing? Or is what I'm thinking about good? I think that allowed me to then go into a meeting and champion a particular technical solution or design.
Yeah.
And I think without that ability to be in the office and yet talking to a trusted source to give me a little bit of extra confidence.
Yeah.
I don't think I could have made it to where I am today.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. That's wonderful. Because I use Skype for the same reason too, to build allies and to make friends, but also to help out whenever I feel stuck. So that makes total sense. So,
and I think that's something that I would definitely encourage women starting out in a tech field is have one or two people that you really trust as your lifeline that you can reach out to and feel okay asking what you might think is a stupid question. And this is also an aspect of how I try to act as a resource to women and men, any of my employees, but specifically to women when I see them suffering from levels of imposter syndrome or struggling with vulnerability, is I often find that if I can just help tell them, hey, what you're proposing, you might not convince the other person, but I think is a solid, reasonable argument to make. That can often be enough to get them over the hurdle and willing to at least champion a technical decision.
That's amazing. So if you had to sum up your story in a couple of sentences, can you do that for us?
I think that the way I like to tell my story is embrace serendipity, but have a few guiding principles that you care about. And so when I left Apple, I honestly didn't know that what I was going to do next. I went to University of Chicago, but I could have just as easily become a user researcher or a tech writer or come back to engineering. But I think it's okay. I think it's okay to make choices that you don't necessarily know how you'll land. And as long as you're absorbing new data as you do that journey and processing it and trying to make connections and learn from your experiences, you never know what's going to happen. And so one of the things that how I embrace that now in my job is I've heard someone else give this advice and I take it to heart, which is I try to spend at least 10% of my time, taking meetings or mentoring someone or doing something that I don't yet know why this is valuable.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. And that's going to be a quote on our social media everywhere. So when the episode comes out, it's going to be beautiful. And it is going to help a lot of women who are in STEM fields or are struggling to just take that chance, and go with it, right?
Yeah, and if I can add a little piece around something that I've been thinking a lot about lately is I think that society has trained women to be very afraid of risk. Yeah. And I've noticed this a lot in the hiring of engineers for my startup. There's such a bias, I think, because of the culture that we live in, for women to shy away from early startups and go to large companies for that safety and security. Yeah. And I think that, again, especially early in your career, when you don't have that many specific obligations, that risk, it may not pay out in terms of that specific company having a financial payout, but you might have a different set of experiences, who you network with, who your mentors are, how close you are to your various colleagues. That can have a much greater impact on your career 10 years down the line when you need to have a connection to someone who will champion you either as an investor or to get you that high level VP job. That's super important. But I think that a lot of those types of connections happen in a much stronger way at small companies than they do large companies, because it's such a stressful, we're in it together sort of environment.
Yeah, no, that's a great advice, and that's something that I have tried to implement in my life. And it's always easy to say, oh, someone makes more money, some places much bigger, some places this, some places that. But really like counting your allies and counting people who are really cheering you on, even when it may not be the most glamorous thing, right? In comparison to other people, really truly makes sense, because it's an investment that you do in yourself. And even if it's a trade-off in terms of how much you get paid, or sometimes it can be a rotational role, or it can be something that is not your, you don't know this and you don't know everything about the department, it's worth taking a shot, right? So before we let you go, please tell us your favorite book.
My favorite book, there's so many. Okay. I think that the book this is not maybe my favorite book of all time, but a recent book that I remember that I've read that I really like is Americana. I think because it has such an interesting take on what the immigrant experience, especially as a woman, is in America.
That's awesome. I need to read that too. I've heard a lot of people talk about that. So awesome. Thank you so much, Tina, for taking the time and for sharing your wonderful STEM story with us.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to you.
And that was Tina with her inspiring STEM story. Please use the links in the episode notes to follow Tina and her amazing work. If you want to chat with me one-on-one and talk all about conquering your STEM career, then book a call with me now by using the link in the episode notes as well. This is a free discovery call where I'll be talking to you on how to make 2020 the best year of your life. This is also a beta call, which means your feedback to this call will help me design programs, courses, and coaching in 2020. So please take some time and reserve that call. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next week on Monday and Wednesday. Bye.